The original Legend of Zelda came out on February 21st, 1986, aka over 37 years ago. Today, which is hopefully the day the latest Zelda game releases, Tears of the Kingdom, I'd like to take a look back to the past and see whether or not the original Legend of Zelda is still good. I'll be judging the game by modern day standards, with slight leniency to graphics and sound quality, since the technology didn't allow them to do much with it. Also, I haven't played many Zeldas, having only played the original, the second, really bad one, the third, really good one, and my favorite game of all time, Breath of the Wild. I wish I could play more of them, but I only have a Switch and a Wii, and I'm not paying $50 a year for a few 25-year-old games. Alright, let's get one of the biggest things out of the way. This game is hard. Like, really hard. And that's coming from someone who 300% Cuphead and beat Halo Reach on Legendary. Oh, and I 100% in Mario The Lost Levels, so I think I know what's hard on the NES. You basically need a guide to beat this game, because the puzzles are infamous for being extremely cryptic. Like, how the hell am I supposed to know you can blow up a random wall to skip an entire section of a dungeon? I did 2 playthroughs for this game, one without a guide and one with a guide. The first one went kind of terribly. This video will be split into 3 main parts: gameplay, story, and content. This is the first part of the video, gameplay. This will cover the game's controls, mechanics, combat, exploration, items, and other things about the world. First, the controls are kind of wonky and imprecise. Everything except Link moves on a sort of grid system, making Link constantly run into walls or be misaligned with the enemy, which is extremely frustrating. Also, this game works terribly with the joystick of a Pro Controller, obviously because it wasn't designed for a joystick, but it's still kind of annoying. Combat is also kind of messed up, since it feels like every time Link turns to face the enemy in time, you either miss or the enemy hits you. This is where the rewind feature comes in, which basically cheapens every fight in the game. I don't want to use it, but I feel like I can't take a hit because I lose the extremely OP sword beams if I get hit. The sword beams are so strong because they hit as hard as the sword and shoot from a range. It puts the bow and boomerang to shame. Both of these suck in comparison. The boomerang feels like it only kills keys, and everything else shrugs it off like you tickled it. The bow also sucks because of how much it drains your wallet, which is extremely important for buying literally everything in the game, so there's no reason to use the bow over the sword beams. I guess this is a segue into the item section, so let's get into it. The bombs are pretty useful, but I don't feel like I can use them in fights often because I need a ton of them to find random heart containers scattered throughout the world. The raft and ladder are situational but really useful items that are pretty fun to use. I'm talking about the ladder, not the raft. The raft is literally used twice. The blue ring is literally insane since it doubles your defense, but you have to murder a few hundred troops to get it. Potions are nice to have, since keeping your health up is basically necessary, but they're a bit expensive. The magic shield is also a great upgrade, allowing Link to block most projectiles, but Link always has a shield, so before he gets the magic one, does he just have it like hanging on his side, useless? The red ring is just the blue ring, but better. The bait is only needed in one dungeon in a very dumb puzzle. The dragon key is super OP, but is unlocked in the second to last dungeon, making it nearly useless. The power bracelet is also nearly useless, only unlocking certain fast travel points. The wand is pretty useful, being slightly weaker sword beams that shoot fire after you get the magic book, but most enemies are immune to the fire, and the beams itself don't do much damage. No. The fire also renders the red candle useless, which is just a blue candle, but you can use them more than once per room. And a whistle exists, only being used for pseudo fast travel and killing one boss. Geez, that's a lot of items. I think making progress luck behind exploration is a really cool concept, because in games that come after this, it's done amazingly, such as in Breath of the Wild. Exploration in this game is both the best and worst part of the game. The idea that you can go anywhere and beat the game however you want to is a cool one, but is severely undercut by the main source of progression, being bombing every random wall in Hyrule. I wish this game had a bit more pushing you in the direction of the dungeons, or a map that was actually helpful. I think the minimap is the most useless thing in the game, since it only gives you a vague idea of where the hell you are in this actually quite large map for an NES game. The fact I could go anywhere screwed up my first playthrough, since I missed the raft in Dungeon 3, so I explored the map and actually walked into the Lost Woods, which is completely optional and there's no reason to even go there. Which is completely optional and there is no reason to even go to the Lost Woods in the graveyard. After a quick Google search, I got through it and stumbled into what I believe is the 7th dungeon, without any of the necessary items. Again, I can't fault the developers for not being able to do much with dialogue or directions, but seriously, I shouldn't be able to so easily miss key items and stumble into one of the hardest areas in the game. After this, I quit and used the guide, so I would be stronger and not be screwed over as easily. My first run, I beat the first 3 dungeons, stumbled into Dungeon 7, and then got stuck at Gleeok in Dungeon 4. The dungeons overall are fine in my opinion, but not great. They have some dumb puzzles like, push this random block, light the room with an item you may not have, kill a bunch of enemies that one-shot you. Overall, this game's got interesting gameplay, but it's got quite a few issues. Okay, it's time for story content. This will be a recap of the story and dungeons. Dungeon 1 is super easy, and I can't remember its boss. Alright, Aquamenus. Aquamenus is extremely easy. Just spam sword beams slightly not in front of him. Easy. The dungeon itself is super easy as well, since there aren't many dangerous enemies. Also, what are these funny looking statues for? Are they the ancient Zonai? While we're here, I may as well mention the story of the game. Since I don't have the manual, I don't really know it, but I think it's something like Zelda split the Triforce into 8 pieces to prevent Ganon from getting the final piece of the Triforce. Also, there are only 2 pieces of the Triforce in this game, so don't ask where the Tri came from. Evil magician Gamblegork comes and kidnaps the princess for some reason, and Link has to assemble the pieces, which are placed in deadly dungeons full of Ganon's minions. And the Triforce chunk is guarded by what I presume are Ganon's top minions? If Ganon's gone into the dungeons, why has he just taken the pieces of the Triforce? And why does Link need to assemble them? He's just bringing the complete Triforce to Ganon. The story makes no sense to me. So tell me in the comments if the manual clears some things up. Anyway, we grabbed the bow in Dungeon 1 and the boomerang. Both are semi-useful items. Dungeon 2 has a very significant difficulty spike, with many of the enemies being much tougher. This dungeon also doesn't have a specific item associated with it, but we get the famous line of Dodongo dislikes smoke. Another cryptic hint that you're supposed to make Dodongo, the boss of the dungeon, run into bombs. I guess he said bomb the dumb dinosaur, the solution would be too obvious, since the boss is weirdly easy if you know what you're doing. What I dislike is that if you don't have enough bombs going into this, you're absolutely screwed and must die. I get this game was made in a different era, but that's just cheap. We grab our chunk of the Triforce and get out of there. Next is a controversial one that aged like milk. Luckily, it's not something that would get me demonetized, it's something that I really don't know what it means. Either way, this dungeon is home to the raft, and what the hell is this? Manhaldla? I'm gonna just call it Nightmare Fuel. This dungeon is fine. It's not too hard, although the Dark Nuts are pretty difficult on your first attempt. Nightmare Fuel is also a pretty tricky boss, since it moves around so fast, whereas Link moves as fast as a snail. Overall, a neat dungeon, but kind of forgettable. Next, Dungeon 4, home of and Gleeok. This dungeon made me reset, all because Gleeok is such a dumb boss. I took a hit in the Manji dungeon, because you basically need it in order to get the raft, so I didn't have the sword beams. I also didn't have arrows, since I thought they were useless. This screwed me over in a Gleeok fight, where you need to have beams or arrows to even damage the boss. If you don't, screw you. You have to walk up to the boss and pray your sword actually hits, or you don't get shot. This fight is garbage and I hate it. The dungeon itself is fine, you can skip most of it by bombing a wall, and there's not a Nightmare Fuel refight. That's about it. Dungeon 5 is an interesting one, with an interesting, albeit stupid puzzle to get to it. You need to walk up this hill 4 times. How the hell was I supposed to know that? The dungeon itself is pretty standard, but the blue dark nuts are super difficult. The item is the whistle, which makes the dungeon boss, Dig Dogger, free. Just toot the whistle and he shrinks to the size of a pea, the most forgettable dungeon in the game. Dungeon 6 introduces Wizrobes, which I hate fighting. These enemies are the worst, since they shoot projectiles that deal an insane amount of damage, have a stupid amount of health, are immune to most items, and don't take knockback. These enemies just suck to fight. Also, I'm just gonna mention it, these dungeons are nothing what the guide says they are. This does not look like a dragon, and who the hell thought this was a lizard? Anyway, this dungeon has the most pathetic boss in the game, Goma. This iconic spider goes down in one hit, if you just shoot him in the eye with an arrow. I guess there's also a Gleeok refight, but it's nothing special. Dungeon 7, the demon, has an interesting puzzle to get to it, being the abandoned fairy fountain. You may come across this early in the game, but you won't be able to get in yet due to the need of the whistle. Upon entering, you get a pretty difficult dungeon filled with boomerang dudes. This dungeon has quite a few boss fights with 3 Dig Doggers, 2 groups of Dodongo, and the dungeon boss is Aqua Menace, with the same health as he did in the first dungeon. Come on man, he dies in 2 shots! The boomerang dudes were stronger than you. This dungeon item isn't even that good, since it's the red candle, which is just a blue candle, but you can use them more than once. This dungeon kind of sucks. Dungeon 8 is the lion, which, again, doesn't look like a lion. It's also got the dumbest way to access it. Burn this random bush at the start of the game. Congratulations, devs, you earned the trophy for best designed dungeon. End ring. Just cut that out. I can understand putting extra rupees and heart containers behind random bushes and random walls, but a mandatory dungeon? What the hell? This dungeon is filled with nightmare fuel and Goma refights, and the final boss is a 4-headed Gleeok. Gleeok is super easy with the sword beams, but eventually I just went into the Gleeok and tore him up from the inside. This dungeon contains the magic book and the dragon key, both of which are not very useful items. The magic books makes the magic rod shoot fire, making the candle useless, but the rod still isn't that useful since most enemies are immune to fire. The dragon key, I know it's called a magical key, but dragon key sounds cooler, is an infinite key that can be used on any door. This is pretty useful, but since it's in the second to last dungeon, it's only really useful if you want to revisit dungeons. We finally collect the final piece of the Triforce and head to Spectacle Rock, the lair of Demon King Ganon. This final fight is super difficult to navigate, as it is the largest dungeon in the game. We get the red ring and the silver arrows here. I believe the silver arrows are mandatory to beat this game, but I'm not sure. This dungeon is also a really big maze, which is nearly impossible to do without a guide. Once you finally commit mass Wizrobe murder, we fight Ganon. This will be the fight of the century. Oh, he's already dead. Seriously, that was so anticlimactic. We find Zelda, put out a fire, and we finish the game, saving Hyrule once and for all. Until the sequel. And the other sequel. And the entire franchise after it. Finally, content time. This game offers about 5 hours of content if you're going for 100% with a guide. And you don't do the second quest, which, hell no. There is no reward for 100%ing the game, aside from making it much easier, so it doesn't really matter if you go 100% or not. I highly suggest using a guide as well, since it's impossible to make your way through certain dungeons without bombing random walls and specific items. Overall, this is a pretty fun game that I will give 6.5 pieces of Triforce out of 10 Zeldas. If you want me to review Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, or Tears of the Kingdom, let me know with a like, comment, or subscribe. Now, with that said, see you guys next time.